Number one, market trends. So if you're interested in creating a podcast and you're struggling with ideas to come up with, to talk about on a regular basis, let's say you watched my previous video on this subject where I covered the top ways that you can start your podcast absolutely free by clicking the link in the description of this video. But now that you've taken this crazy bearded guy's advice, you're trying to figure out, Marvin, what in the world can I talk about for my podcast on a regular basis? I got you covered. So we are covering the top 6 ideas for your next podcast. If you're just tuning in, this is Marvin, your brother, your uncle, your favorite realtor's favorite realtor, coming to you with the Monday live stream where I drop tips and strategies and ways for you as a real estate entrepreneur or real estate agent to level up your content using video and social media. So on the last live stream that we covered on Friday, I talked about how important it was for you right now to stop limiting yourself and create that real estate podcast. Because you know what? Yes, there are millions of ideas out there, and yes, there are a million podcasts out there, but you have something unique to add to the marketplace. So stop holding yourself back. I gave you the game. Now, if you execute on that game, that determines the cost that you pay, but the game is absolutely free. So check out the live stream from last Friday, and I gave you the entire blueprint, my entire blueprint on how I create my podcast, distribute my podcast, and then I use it to generate leads and business on an ongoing basis. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is market trends. So I know if you follow this channel for long enough, I'm not the biggest fan of sharing market trends on a regular basis with buyer and seller clients, typically because it consists of a lot of jargon that only you and I know. We are the ones that studied about riparian rights and 43,560 feet being a square foot, an acre. I don't know why I know that and why I'm never going to forget that. But using jargon and talking about, the year over year inventory and all that stuff, it can be a little overwhelming for your next buyer or seller client. But if you need an idea for a podcast, talking about market trends would be a good way to start. And I'm going to show you a couple of sources that you can leverage to do that on a regular basis. Because as I mentioned, there are some people that, they may actually get value from consuming that via a podcast where you're deep diving on the subject matter of market trends and what's going on a regular basis in the market. So one place that you could try to leverage and look into utilizing would be a place like, let's say, Remind, for example. I'm a big fan of Remind personally because Remind gives me the ability to see what's going on in any given moment in my city, and then I can take the information that I'm getting on a regular basis, and then I can just literally regurgitate it back out. So for example, in Atlanta, Georgia, I leverage on my Remind page. And if you have MLS access, 9 times out of 10, you have access to Remind for your particular city. But you can go on your Remind page on a daily basis, and then you can look at the area here called Market Pulse. Now, Market Pulse is simply a breakdown of what's going on in your city in a given moment. You can expand the search using this tab right here. Enter in a particular zip code. I entered in Atlanta, Georgia. And so my podcast idea, for example, I could talk about how many homes are active on the market as of the last week, how many have gone under contract, how many have closed, how many have expired. This may be an opportunity to leverage maybe following up with this individual and explaining to other individuals how you reach out to expired listings and potentially turn those into listings for yourself. How many were withdrawn and random status updates. So if I wanted to see what's going on in my city in the last, let's just say 7 days or 30 days or yesterday, I could literally do a podcast here talking about the market and what this data means for my area in general. And if there is scarcity going on, or if we are in fact dealing with low inventory, or if the market is fairly normal compared to this time last year. But you can use information on something like your Remind website or your local MLS and create a podcast around that. So that's idea number one. And we're talking about 6 for today's live stream. But another thing that you could leverage and use to talk about in your podcast, for example, so we talked about number one is market trends, but now you could talk about investment strategies. That's another idea. Investment strategies, meaning we cater to your owner occupant buyers, clients, and seller clients, but we also need to expand our horizon as real estate professionals and put ourselves out there as investor friendly real estate agents. Because if you've been keeping up, or if you keep up with this kind of stuff, some investors, they don't like working with licensed agents because they feel like there's a disconnect between what the investors' objectives are and what the real estate agent's objectives are. But for me, I put myself out there as a very investor-friendly real estate agent. I love working with wholesalers, for example, and buyers, and people that just do real estate investing holistically. And so for me, I talk about some strategies that are out there. For example, the DSCR loan, which is a loan that it's not as stringent as your traditional conventional loan, right? So someone who, let's say they have a side hustle or a business where their income is 1099, it would be hard for them in a lot of cases to get approved for a loan. Let's say they take a lot of write-offs in their business. So a DSCR loan, for example, would be a good option for those individuals because they don't look at a lot of the stuff that your traditional banks and lenders look at. They just want to know that if a person's interested in purchasing a property for investment, that the rent rolls will satisfy and make the numbers look what it needs to look like for that particular lender. So that's a strategy that if I were to create real estate content, I could just do content talking about the different types of strategies out there and loans that are available, and funding and financing, owner financing, seller financing is what I meant to say. And those types of loans and strategies out there, creative finance is what they call it in these real estate streets. But I could do a podcast dedicated to that. Whereas if I'm looking for a more savvier individual, someone who is a real estate investor, they can come to me and know that they're dealing with an expert and someone that will be able to take care of them, educate them. Let's say they're an out-of-state investor and they need someone on the ground floor. Well, they know that they're working with a real estate agent who knows what's going on with investors and what's important to them. I as well, in our family, we're investors in real estate. So if that's not where you are with things, you can absorb that information, learn it, and be able to regurgitate that information back out on a podcast. So that's another podcast subject that you could talk about. And now we move to my favorite, which is your guest expert interviews. Now, I personally like doing interviews where I'm interviewing another guest, and I'm going to tell you why. For one, when you're interviewing a guest, specifically a subject matter expert, all you're doing as the podcast host is essentially being a guide. You're the person who has brought the audience to see why it is that this person is on your podcast. And the cool thing about the world that we live in is that people like to hear themselves talk. So very rarely have I gotten personally rejected as it relates to a guest being on my podcast. And I've reached out to some pretty big names and had some pretty big names on the podcast. My greatest guest as of note is a gentleman by the name of Henry Washington, who is a big time investor and now a good friend of mine because we became friends through the podcast. He's actually given me tips and strategies to help me in my investing world. And he is someone that I've never met in person, but through reaching out to him, because I followed him through Bigger Pockets, which is a really big real estate podcast, probably the number one podcast for real estate investors out there behind, we're coming for him, by the way, we're coming for that throne. But I found out about him on the Bigger Pockets podcast, which before I became licensed and all that stuff, I just followed that podcast. It's a great podcast. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, would you be interested in being on my podcast? So I presented myself to him like an expert, like someone who takes what I'm doing seriously, and he obliged. And it was so much game that I learned in the audience. I mean, it was my greatest viewed video to date. And so for you, if you are not super comfortable talking to the microphone or talking to the camera on video for an hour or 2 hours, bringing individuals who are subject matter experts will be your best bet, because for them, all you're doing is letting them, especially if you reach out to a person who really, you can tell they do this regularly, so talking is not an issue for them. and you're just having a conversation with a friend. It's like literally sitting down for a cup of coffee and you're letting the audience come in to see what it is that you have going on. And so I would suggest you reaching out to individuals in that space. And a couple of videos that I want to share here of people that do that are as follows. So we're here on YouTube right now, and if you were to just look at a couple of individuals, Patrick Bet David here with Valuetainment, Millionaire Mindset. Who's this handsome fella here? That's my podcast. Okay, so when you Google or if you look up real estate podcast, my podcast is showing up as number 3. That's awesome. And then if you just keep scrolling here, these are all. This is Bigger Pockets, as I mentioned, the number 1 podcast on real estate, and Ryan Pineda. So these are just a few individuals here that do real estate related podcasts with guests. Brandon Turner on Ryan Pineda's podcast. I mean, Brandon Turner is literally like the OG in this. So I wouldn't say necessarily reach out to any of these super popular names, but you never know, right? And you'll only miss, what do they say? You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. So even if you weren't able to necessarily get any of these big time guests, if you were to literally start at a place like a Bigger Pockets and you just comb through all of the guests that they've had on their show and reach out to a few of them that may not necessarily be your A-list guests, maybe you start with your B-list and your C-list guests. For one, because we all need the opportunity to showcase the skill set that we have. And for 2, these individuals are kind of pre-vetted, because if they've already been on Bigger Pockets, that means that they are really serious about what it is that they're doing. But even if you don't necessarily want to reach out to anyone on those type of platforms, maybe in your immediate sphere, maybe there's someone who's really crushing it in your local market. Maybe there's a business that you'd like to highlight and feature, and let's say it's, one of the great places to get barbecue locally in your area. Maybe you reach out to that owner and ask them if they'd be interested in coming on your podcast, talking about how long they've been in business, and just sharing general information on what got them into the barbecue game. I mean, the sky is literally the limit on how you decide to run your podcast. But guest interviews that are subject matter experts are always going to be super dope. So another thing that you could talk about as well on your podcast, neighborhood spotlights. So neighborhood spotlights is definitely a podcast. And remember, with your podcast, you can do whatever you want with it. Obviously you want to follow the general format where you're sitting in a place stationary, good audio, good visual. On my previous video, I linked up all of the gear that I use for this particular podcast, and I may even link it in this podcast, so just check the replay. But neighborhood spotlights is another under-leveraged type of podcast that you could feature, but a couple folks do it here that I want to showcase because they're doing a really good job with how they're running there. So if I Googled this, like don't move to Texas, for example, here are a couple individuals. This guy here living in Houston, Texas. Let's check out his video and see what he's got good going on here. Okay, so he is, let me see if I can get the audio going here. Hold on a second.
Absolutely think you're gonna hate. We're gonna put this box down. We're gonna go through each one of these, and I will be brutally honest and not sugarcoat any of them. Your job is to see if you can handle any of these.
Let's see what else he's got going on.
In your car because it'll be gone. About the schools, it's interesting because in our previous states we lived in.
So this particular podcast, as you see, looks like it's 2 individuals, and I just kind of scrolled through it a little bit, and it looks like they are talking about the schools in a particular area. The video title is "Don't Move to Houston, Texas Unless You Can Handle These 15 Facts." 23 minutes, so it is definitely looking like it's like a video podcast where the individuals are, 2 of them here, as I see, as you just saw, are talking about their respective, a particular part of the city that they're recommending you don't move into. Now, if I had to guess, these individuals are probably real estate agents. Let me go into the description, and they've got 85,000 views. That's awesome. And yep, contact Joe Rodriguez, Texas Realtor. So yeah, so these are real estate agents, and this is a really good idea. I personally have not done these types of videos yet on this channel, but I plan on it, where you are giving individuals the lowdown on things that they're going to want to be aware of before they move to your particular city. So as a real estate agent, I handle relocation clients all the time. Several, mainly from the East Coast, that come down to Georgia because of the weather, things of that nature. And so oftentimes they'll ask me certain things about the South that they want to kind of get ahead of or know about. Mainly with our HOAs, if our HOAs are super crazy like they are up north. And it's really a great opportunity for me to kind of educate individuals that, what's going on in Georgia is not, from an HOA standpoint, is not like other cities and states. We have HOAs, but they're not super duper crazy like they can be in some states. And so another thing I talk about with Georgia would be the bugs. We got a lot of them down here, okay? A lot of bugs. And so if I wanted to, I could create a video podcast where I talk about the things you want to be aware of on the negative side about Georgia. And conventional wisdom may have you thinking that that's going to scare people from moving, but people will appreciate that you give them that insight proactively, especially when it's kind of material information, than for them to come down and then they're like, Marvin, why didn't you tell me that Georgia has crazy bugs, things of that nature. So, you can always put a positive spin on it, but people will truly appreciate you when you keep it, you keep it honest with them. So you obviously you don't want to talk about anything when you're spotlighting a neighborhood. You don't want to talk about anything that goes into crime or whether a school system is better than another one or things of that nature. Those are areas that as licensed professionals, we cannot give our opinions on that. We would allow the buyer to do their own due diligence in that area, and we can point them to resources where they can find that information. But you don't want to not be clear and be honest on certain things, like I said, about the weather, things that don't lead to discrimination in any kind of way. You can talk about bugs all day. You can talk about how hot it can get here in the South, depending on the state, but you can't get into whether one neighborhood is safer or better than the other. That's the kind of stuff you can't do. But with your neighborhood spotlights, as I mentioned, you can use it as an opportunity to talk about a particular part of town, some really cool amenities there, some new businesses that are moving into that area, some new theme parks, all that kind of cool stuff. That in and of itself would be a great podcast where you are situating yourself as the subject matter expert, aka the mayor of that particular area. So we're going to go to a quick commercial break here. If you're getting value from this podcast where I'm giving you 6 ideas for your next podcast, smash like, is greatly appreciated, and we will be right back. Real estate agent looking to jumpstart your career? Join our online agent network and gain access to the support and resources you need to succeed. One of the most effective ways to attract clients in this industry is through social media. And I can tell you, in my entire time as a real estate professional, I have not knocked on one door, and yet I've still generated several $1 million worth of sales per year. And our team is here to help you do the same thing. Click the link in today's show notes today or visit IamTheTribe.com to learn more about this amazing opportunity. Now back to the show. All right, y'all, we're back. All right, so next thing that we're going to talk about here is need to know for buyers and sellers. So in the previous segment here, I talked about neighborhood spotlights being super, super important to share, and that'd be a great podcast idea. Now, need to knows for buyers and sellers, that'd be another really, really good podcast idea. And what that means is every single podcast, you can talk about, for example, the importance of getting a home inspection and in what scenarios it might be important to get more than one home inspection, right? So when you're thinking about your new construction homes, for example, there's 2 inspections that you're going to want to get on a regular basis. You're going to want to get a pre-drywall inspection, which means you get the home inspected by a licensed professional before the drywall goes up in your new construction home. And then you get an inspection after, which is the normal home inspection. Now, the reason you're going to want to do that, especially for your new construction purchases, is an inspector, if they walk into a home and they just inspect your average home on 123 Banana Street, they are only going to be able to tell you what's going on with that home visually. They can't move any furniture out of the way. They can't, drill into the wall and look inside and look at the framing or anything like that. They can go under, crawl spaces and things of that nature. But before that drywall goes up, there can be issues with the home from a wiring standpoint, from a framing standpoint, a couple of things that have happened in my experience, because, I've worked with new construction buyers, and it's a lot that you would think, because the home is new, that it won't have anything wrong with it, but that could be further from the truth. So that could be a conversation in and of itself, that you, as the subject matter expert, are educating buyers on how important it is to get an inspection. Maybe also educating buyers on what an FHA is specifically, and the types of individuals that would be good fits for those, who would be a good fit for your conventional, who would be a good fit for your USDA type of loans, right? Because we know USDA loans, those are more geared towards your rural areas. So if you have a buyer that's interested in living, like here in Georgia, for example, we got a bunch of rural areas. There are some benefits for folks to leverage a USDA type of loan, for example. Or you might talk about the different down payment assistance programs that are out there. The Chenoa, for example, in Georgia, the Georgia Dream, but the Chenoa is a national down payment assistance program that's out there. That's some helpful information that someone would find very valuable if they find your content and you're educating individuals on all of the down payment assistance programs available locally and national for them. You could even talk about why it's important and who pays for an appraisal, for example. A lot of people don't know that the appraisal is something that is an additional cost on top of an inspection that a person has to come up with before they pay their down payment and the closing cost. Those are things that if you were to just literally say, this episode, I'm going to take some experience that I've dealt with representing buyers and share that story and how it can help another individual that is interested in reaching out to me. And I'm telling you, once you position yourself that way as the subject matter expert, for one, you're going to have a litany of content to create. There will not be any end of content that you can create on a place like YouTube or on your own audio podcast, where as you are doing more videos like this and more podcasts like this, the algorithm will begin to see that you are, one, taking it serious, and will begin to push your information out to a brand new audience. And then these individuals will find you, and these are going to be individuals you don't have to pay for. These are leads that you don't have to pay for. They found you through a platform like YouTube. And the cool thing with YouTube is that they allow you now to do a podcast, to where if you create your podcast on a place like YouTube, for example, it'll push it out to YouTube's podcast network, which is not Apple or Spotify or anything like that. It's YouTube essentially getting into the game as far as the podcast game. And so they now have an opportunity for us as creators, content creators, to create our own video podcast to go alongside the audio podcast on your Apples and your Spotifys. And I already did a video on how you can get your setup going for that. So just check the previous live stream or check the description of this video to get that information. But I'm telling you all, educating folks and answering specific questions, that's going to be so key to growing as an individual, as a content creator, as a podcaster. If you're answering questions, and there are a number of sources that you can use. You can go to a few different websites that are out there now that I won't necessarily name drop on here, because I want you to think about it yourself, especially if you've had a few closings under your belt, or you haven't had a few closings under your belt. What are some of the things that, if you are a homeowner or someone that would like to be a homeowner, what are some of the things that you have experienced or heard other agents in your office experience, right? In my brokerage here, and if you're interested in joining EXP, I'd love to talk about becoming your sponsor. I'd be honored to have that conversation and to walk hand in hand with you to help you become as successful as possible. But one of the cool things that we have as agents here with EXP is we have a place called Workplace, which is our social network, if you will. And within Workplace, which is a offshoot of Facebook, That's how we all talk with each other as real estate agents. And individuals that are brand new agents and folks that are seasoned agents will ask different questions to us as other agents in the group to see if we've dealt with this situation and how we would handle it. And for me, I'm always in there. I try to be very, very active, helping other individuals answer questions that they have going on or issues they're running into if I know the answer. But I also use it as an opportunity to get some content ideas, because I'm like, okay, if this agent and that agent and this agent is dealing with this issue, this might be something that other agents or other potential clients might be dealing with. So let me create some content off of this. So you can leverage forums like that. Like I mentioned, if you're part of our brokerage here, reach out to me. I'd love to have that conversation with you if you're interested in joining. But even if you go on your other forums that are out there, Facebook groups, things of that nature, real estate related Facebook groups, you're going to see ideas and issues that people are having that may make a good podcast episode. So just think about it. You got to go through some unorthodox ways, but you can even leverage AI and utilize something like a chat GPT. So that's another option. I won't, AI is kind of a horse that's already being beaten to death already at this point. Everybody's talking about AI, but if you just don't have any ideas, I would even use a chat GPT and ask it a question such as, hey, chat GPT, give me 10, lesser known issues that individuals have during the home buying process, and see what it comes up with. And of course, you don't want to just copy that verbatim, but it'll give you a general framework that you can use to come up with your podcast episode. So that's, again, do with that information as you will. As I told you guys, I'm going to give you guys some actionable nuggets here. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about here is real estate horror stories. If you've been doing this long enough, like I have, you've had some pretty crazy situations that you've had to deal with. I know I have. And I've dealt with everything from a client stalking. One of my clients was stalking their ex-spouse, and they were looking for that person's information before they sold their home. It was a mess, y'all. But they were literally a stalker. And that was just a really crazy situation that I had to kind of navigate. I've had individuals get divorces shortly after closing that I heard about. I mean, I've had people that won't leave the house after closing, like they're literally squatting in the home after closing. I mean, I've had some of every situation that personally I've had to deal with. So you might have some stories or scenarios that you've heard about, maybe that you've directly dealt with, or stories that you've had an intimate experience with that would be great to talk about on a podcast, because we all like to hear the good things, but we do live in a bit of a messy world from time to time. So I wouldn't say to go like the gossip, gossipy type of route with a podcast, but maybe you can share what you learned from a particularly horrible experience that you dealt with, either representing a buyer or representing a seller. That would be great content that folks would love to talk about. And it really will allow you to realize that the content that we create as real estate professionals and investors, we might think that the experience that we dealt with was just for us to deal with. But I always say that, there's a blessing in every lesson. So if I learned something that makes me better, sharper, faster as a real estate professional, and it was a pretty horrible experience, I would not be a good person if I kept that information to myself and I didn't share what I learned from it, how I got better from it, what stuff I realized not to deal with because of that experience, so on and so forth. So we're not meant to keep that information to ourselves. So don't do that. If you've got a story or an experience that you've had to deal with, maybe you took somebody on a showing and it got a little weird and you had to bounce up out of there, or you had to kung fu chop somebody. These are all things that you're helping your fellow real estate professional avoid by telling these stories and what you learned from it. So that right there. I mean, that's just 6 ideas that we just talked about that you literally could branch off, and you got 6 days out of the week. If you wanted to do a podcast every day where you cover market trends, investment strategies, you get a guest on one day, you do a neighborhood spotlight, you talk about need to know for buyers and sellers, and then lastly, real estate horror stories. I mean, you literally legit could do a podcast every single week. So If you got value from this particular live stream, smash the like button. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this adds value to you. If you've been watching a video, I'd say more than one video of mine, go ahead and subscribe. Because as I mentioned, the content that I create, again, I'm your brother, your uncle, your favorite realtor's favorite realtor at this point. And I'm here to help. Literally and truly here to help. I do these types of videos because I try to create the content I wish someone had created for me when I was at a certain space in my real estate career. And I want all of us to get better. I don't want folks avoiding the camera, avoiding creating podcasts because they don't have any idea of what to create. I've given you 6 ideas to go off of, and you can literally, truly today start your podcast using some or all of the subject matter that I covered. But ultimately, you got to do it. You have to do it because you have an experience, you have a voice, you've got something in you that is meant to be shared with the world. So as a person of faith, I'm always going to tell you that, you need to go ahead and do it because it's really not about you anyway. If you realize that it's not about you, even with the podcast, it's not about you. It's about the information that you're sharing with someone else to be a blessing to someone else. You really realize that that's how you do this thing called life. All right, till the next video, this is your brother, your uncle, your favorite realtor's favorite realtor signing off, and I will see you